So we're still here in the Dolomites, and we've come over today to the west side of the Dolomites, to Trentino. Earlier, for the previous 5 days, we've been in the eastern side, around Cortina and Miserina. But now we've moved up to a place called Alpi di Siusi, which is a high alpine plain, and you can see it behind me. It's dotted with these rolling hills, these kind of small trees, small wooden huts, which are just really, really photogenic. And beyond that, what you would normally see behind me are two peaks of Sassolungo and Sassopiatto, but they're totally obscured by cloud now. We've been here for about an hour now. And there's a lot of cloud when we came out, but we thought we'd give it a try anyway. It's the first night here. And what's been happening while we've been here is that the clouds kept clearing and giving us glimpses of the peaks behind them. Now, this location is generally somewhere that people tend to shoot wide angle to try to get everything. So you've got these rolling hills with the huts and with the trees and the mountains behind it. And it just makes this really deep shot. Has a lot of depth. But it's equally nice to shoot this with telephotos. So it's been really nice tonight. What we've been doing is just zooming in on parts of the peaks and using the clouds to frame them. So as the clouds kind of leave a hole, you use the cloud as a frame and just get an abstract shot. And I've been doing that with panoramas, shooting panoramas across the whole scene of just the peaks. And then also trying to shoot scenes with the telephoto where I'm actually incorporating parts of the lower landscape with the trees and stuff. And also the peaks behind with a longer lens that gives me some kind of compression which pushes everything together and makes the peaks at the back seem a lot more impressive. Now, the light's gone. We had some lovely light earlier. It's gone now. I don't really know how much shooting we're going to get done. There's a possibility of a sunset, but I don't have high expectations because there's so much cloud over in the west that I don't think the light's going to be able to reach us over here where we are. So I think it's just going to get darker and grey. So yeah, we'll hang around probably for another 30 minutes, 45 minutes, see what the sunset's doing. And it's already been great. So whatever we get now is just a bonus. So it's just a little bit before sunrise now. We're back at Alpi di Siusi, and if you can see behind me, the valley is just full of this incredible mist, which is just absolutely wonderful. Now, with these kind of conditions, I'm really not that interested in shooting wide. The mountain is completely silhouetted and backlit anyway. There's no contrast, there's no shape or detail there. But what's really fascinating is all of these huts and trees and isolating them with a telephoto lens. When you start to look around, there are just so many different compositions, so many different angles, so many different things to point the camera at. And the mist creates this incredible separation of layers. It really adds a whole element, so much mood to the actual scene. So what I'm doing is I'm just moving the camera around, just trying to find isolated spots like a couple of cabins together or a single tree, and just make a really kind of minimal abstract frame like that. Now with these kind of shots, the hardest thing is always trying to keep the edges of the frame clean, because you find that two huts that you really like and you kind of focus on those, but there's often something coming in from the side of the frame or from the bottom of the frame that you have to move. So it really helps in this kind of situation to kind of walk around the scene a little bit, because you find that if you walk just 20 meters in one direction, it makes a difference and you can get a slightly different composition. So what I've been doing this morning just before the sun comes up is just walking around with the group. We're trying to find compositions that we like. And then when the sun comes up, there'll be a few minutes before it burns this mist off, when the mist is going to be really backlit and we'll have golden sidelight coming in and the mist is going to glow. Well, hopefully. So let's have a look at how I edit those misty early morning images. Now, I really don't like to spend hours editing images. 50 minutes is pretty usual for me, maybe 20 minutes. Half an hour is the absolute maximum. What I find is having a set of tools, a toolbox that you can use on images, and an approach really helps a lot. Now, for me, pretty much everything is about contrast, sculpting the light shaping the light to help create the kind of mood that I'm after in an image. So it's darkening parts of the image, brightening other parts of the image, just basically trying to manipulate the way that the viewer's eye moves through the image and using local adjustments to do that. I also think it's really important to have a kind of a good idea of where you're going to go with the editing, with the processing before you actually sit down, because I find that just pushing sliders and seeing, does this work, never really works. Just have an idea of what the mood is, of what the effect is that you're going for, that you're trying to create before you sit down and start processing the image in Lightroom. Now, when I was in the field, I didn't actually have the focal length that I needed to capture the image in the way that I wanted to. So what I do in those situations is that I shot it as a multi-image panorama. So what I actually did here was shot a vertical image with 2 rows of 6 images going down vertically, 2 vertical rows, which has given me all the images you can see at the bottom here. And now I'm just going to stitch these together in Lightroom. Now, Lightroom is usually very good at this kind of thing, at finding edges and stitching them all together. So we select all the images, and then we right click here, and we're going to go to photo merge and panorama, and what that's going to do is arrange all the images together, as you can see there. Now, there are different ways that you can get Lightroom to form the panorama. I generally prefer, depending on the image, to use something like cylindrical or spherical. If I've shot it at a wider focal length, something like 24 millimeters, then I would probably go for perspective to try to keep the perspective. But because this is shot using a telephoto length at 55 millimeter on my Fuji, which is about 82 millimeter on a full frame, I don't really have any worries about perspective. So I'm going to put it in cylindrical, and then I'm going to push boundary warp all the way to the right there just to fill it out. Now, again, if you're shooting wide angle, this would give you quite a lot of distortion, but because it's shot with a telephoto focal length, then that's not going to be a problem. Then these are always off, auto crop off and auto settings off, and then I just click merge. So you can see here, this is the stitched image. I'm just going to get rid of this to give myself a little bit more space on the screen. And this is kind of what I was looking at, what I was hoping to get. I wanted to make sure I had both sides of the mountain and the complete length of the tree, but it doesn't really capture the mood that I wanted to portray there. I want something brighter. I want to really show the mist. And what I'm finding here is I've got 2 color tones. I've got blue and I've got a kind of greeny brown. And I'd like to get something a little bit more consistent in color tone. So the first thing I'm going to do is just increase the color temperature up just a little bit, somewhere around about there, just to warm the image, to give it that kind of early morning feeling that it had. And then I'm going to take the exposure down a little bit. Now, I'm taking the exposure down here because I know that I'm going to be doing lots of different local adjustments and different adjustments to this image. Brightness is going to be changing a lot throughout the image. I'm going to be adding bits in some places, taking it away in others, just to try to give myself the look that I want. But basically at the beginning, what you're doing is creating the palette, giving yourself the base image to work from. And now what I'm going to do is push up the highlights just a little bit, just to 15. Now, I'm not too worried about the highlights clipping here, although they're not quite anyway. There's still a little bit of a gap. I really want to give the idea of a strong light source on the side, because it was the morning. The sun was coming up. There's a clear sky, so the sky was bright. And I really want to, rather than trying to limit the bright highlights, I'd like to lean into them and embrace that. And so what I'm also going to do to encourage that is to go down here to the dehaze tool. Now, the dehaze tool is extremely good for actually adding a kind of hazy brightness, the kind of brightness that you get with morning light, as you can see here. So I'm going to add quite a lot of that. Again, I'm probably going to be taking this down later, but I'm going to push it all the way up to about 75. And you can see now it's really given me that feeling of the light coming in from the side. It's radically changed the feel of the image. It's actually changed the color tones a little bit, whereas before we had the blue and the greens. You can see now we have a much more consistent color tone. And by adding the haze, it's actually increased the feel of the mist there. So now I'm going to be dealing with the bottom half of the image with some graduated filters here. Again, I don't have a problem with the darkness here. I actually like the feeling of the dark bottom of the image going all the way up to a bright sky, but this sunlit grass is kind of interfering with the feel of that. So what I'm going to do there is just work on that with some graduated filters to work on it locally. So we'll click here for the graduated filter. I'm just going to pull that up there, give it a fair bit of feather and just put it up here. So the filter is going to be laid over where there's already a kind of graduation in the light, where we already have the darks here on the right, and it's starting to get brighter in the mist. So I'm just basically going to enhance that and darken the bottom down quite a little bit. So I think we'll go down about 1.5 stops. Quite a lot there. Now again, I'm going to be working on this later on. There's more that I want to do to this, so I'm not too worried about losing all detail there, because I'm going to be bringing it back a little bit later. So I'm also going to add another filter here across this bottom, because that's just a little bit strong. I think we don't need quite so much as that. It's just too much there. Just go down to a little bit more than a stop. Now I'll go back to that later, but what I'm going to do now is go into the curves here. So curves is basically a way of getting a lot of control over the way that you add contrast. So again, I'm going to push the brights up just a little bit here, just to further brighten the sky in the top left. Just going to pull the shadows back down, but not too much. And then I'm going to crush the blacks here. I'm just going to lift the black point up. Now I usually like to do this to about 34, 35, and you can see that's already bringing out a little bit more detail here. So by lifting the blacks up, what you do is you take away that deep blackness, that digital black that you get from all digital cameras, and it gives it a slightly more filmic effect. It kind of fades the black a little bit and just gives them a little bit more texture and makes the shadows a little bit more appealing. Now I'm going to go back to the presence section here and really start to push in some texture and clarity. Now what that's going to do, I hope, is bring out some of the detail in the bottom there. When we touch the clarity, we'll go up to about 30, I think. What that starts to do here is really pull out the edges of the tree that were picking out the light. So that's kind of got me that detail back in the bottom part of the image that I wanted. Now I don't want it to be too strong here, because if I have too much, if it's too visible down there, the eye is going to catch. And what I want to do is make the image all about this shadow to light transition, with the light streaming in and the light going into these and penetrating these shadows, but just picking out these little bits of edges there. Now I think that's all I'm going to do for the moment in Lightroom. What I'm going to do now is open this image in Photoshop and do a few more things to it there. So we right click again and we edit in Photoshop. Alright, so now here in Photoshop, now this is a big image because it's stitched from 13 different images, so you can see it's almost a gigabyte. It's going to slow down my computer a little bit. Now the first thing that I want to do is add a layer. I don't ever do any adjustments on the base layer, so Command J will give me a new layer here. Now what I'm going to do again is just do some tricks to sculpt the light. That's one of the things that I use Photoshop most for. I do most of my contrast work in Lightroom and pretty much all of the heavy lifting. But Photoshop has some tools that are really nice for adding finishing touches to images, or just to sculpt light a little bit more. So I've added a layer here, and then I'm going to go over to the filter over here, the gradient, and I want to select a circular gradient, and you can see it's basically just this one here is the one that I'm using. And I also want to select the color that the gradient is going to be, so I click on that and click on here. That's going to be the color that I use, which is pretty much white anyway, so I just push it up. Just wanted to make sure that the color was the same. So then what I'm going to do is just pull in some gradients from the light source across the image like so. Now because it's a gradient, it's going to be stronger here on the edge than it is where the light source comes in than it is on the further away from where the gradient ends, and I'll just do about 3 of those. Now the effect is very strong, but we're gonna counter that a little while. This isn't how it's going to look at the end. So the first thing that we do is just take that opacity down of that layer down to about 30. which is already diminished a little bit. And I'm going to duplicate that layer with, again, Command J, and then I'm going to change that top layer to soft light. And then I'm going to select both of those and form them into a group, Command G. So now all of those adjustments that I've made, I can just turn on and off like that by turning the layer on and off. And you can see the effect that it's had there. It's very strong. I don't need it that strong. So I'm just going to reduce the opacity a little bit. And the idea really is just to kind of give the idea of the feeling of the light coming in from the side a little bit stronger. So yeah, something like that. Now again, looking at the clipped highlights there, they're not clipping, so I'm not too worried about that. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is just add a little bit of autumn effect. Now we do that by going to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and then an amount of something like about 30, which is what Photoshop set up as default, because that's basically what I always use. So okay, go here again. I'm going to go. You can choose between soft light or overlay. There's not really a difference when by the time you've reduced the opacity, because you should never have the opacity of a Gaussian blur layer too hard, something like 10%. Because this is a very large image, you can actually get away with it being a little bit stronger than that. But if you do it too strong, then the image starts to look a little bit weird. And you can see there, it's just giving a little bit of glow to the highlights. So now I'm going to flatten that and then save that back into Lightroom. Okay, so here we are with the image back in Lightroom. I'm just going to do a few finishing touches. What I think I want to do is just reduce the temperature a little bit. Not too much. I don't want to make it blue, but something like that, just to take a little bit of the orange, of the browny, greeny feel out of it. And then I'm just going to pull the highlights down because they are very strong. So we'll just something like that. And the shadows at the bottom there, we'll push them up just so we can start to see those edge details. So we can see that there's something happening down there, but it's not too strong. Something like that, and that's about perfect. I'm going to do a little bit more work on there actually with another graduated filter at the bottom there, which we'll just put there. Now, because I'm starting to see this again, what I'm going to do is drop the shadows down. Again, everything is kind of putting with one hand, taking away with the other to create a balance. But what I'm going to do is then push the clarity, which is going to bring those edges out. Something like that. Maybe go back with the shadows because I want to really pick out these edges here and around the tree. And then I think we'll just finish off with a little bit of presence. So we'll just put a little bit of texture in, 10, something like that, and add some more clarity. This is an image, because it's so big, it's got so much detail in it. There's not really too much problem with adding quite a little bit of clarity. Something, it's too much. Something like that. And then dehaze just to put that brightness back. Again, keeping an eye on the histogram here for clipping highlights. And it's pretty much finished now. I think I'm just gonna put a little bit of, tiny little bit of crushed blacks. Just go back to the curve there. Very subtle S. And then crush those blacks there up to about something like that. And I think that's it. That's pretty much it for this image. So let's have a look at the original. So you can see this was the raw file before Photoshop, and we can take away all of the adjustments there, comparing the two images side by side. There. So you can see I actually didn't do any work with the color sliders, with the saturation, with the vibrance. This was all done using contrast, adding brightness, adding shadow, working with the clarity tools, sculpting the light to create a really dynamic feel to the image. So that's it for this video. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any comments at all, any questions, just drop them in the box below or send me an email and I'll get back to you. Now I'm going to be back in the Dolomites later in the year when we can travel again, and I'll be leading a workshop there. So I'd love it if you could join me. I'll be there in May. I'll be back there again in September. I'm also going to be doing a hiking workshop where we're going to hike to the top of lots of the peaks in Lofoten sometime in the summer, and I'll be in Tuscany as well. So drop me an email, check out my website, join me on a workshop. I would love to see you. And in the meantime, all the best with your photography. Look after yourselves and take care.